Morning. Well, I hope you've been enjoying my recent podcasts where I've been talking to you about how to build the main character, how to do the sub-characters, and how to do the plots, which I split into two, where the first one was the scenery, and then the second one was the storyline. And I said to you that I've been using the example of my Icelandic character Adalward. And I said last week that I would actually read the story of Adalward. So I've written it, and I'm now going to read part of it, so that kids, you can see how the characters, the storyline, what I've covered over the last few weeks comes to light. So you'll see Adalward, you'll see how I talk about the colour of his duffel coat, his hat, his scarf, his phone, the dog, what type of dog it is. And you'll see me introducing the sub-characters, Fanna and Haldor. They're coming into it. You'll see where I have set the scene, the background that I talk about, and you're now starting to see the plot, the storyline unfold. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the storyline, so as you can see how it all starts to fit. And this is how I do things. So for this podcast, it's going to be a very short podcast. It's just going to be me reading the story to you. See what you think. And it'll be interesting for your views at the end of the podcast to say whether you like the story. Could you see, the connections from the different lessons that I've been doing over the last few weeks? And also, when I said in lesson 5, getting the start right, see what you think to this start and the build up as I take you through the storyline, getting to turn those pages, remember. It's all about turning the pages. So, this is an excerpt, the start of the story of Adalward, my Icelandic boy. Adalward sat on the front doorstep of his house and put on his tan walking boots, for it was his turn to walk Magnus, the family Icelandic sheepdog. He slammed the front door shut, causing a small shelf of snow that had built up over the door to come crashing down. It was early morning, and still shaking the snow from his black duffel coat, Adalward set off down the main road of Stykkisholma, a small fishing town on Iceland's northwest coast. Heading out of town with Magnus in tow towards Sungandisi Island Lighthouse, he could see some of the fishing boats bobbing up and down in the small harbour that was on his left. He looked closer and could see the lights of his father's boat in the distance coming in. Adalward waited until he could see his father from the boat's bridge. He waved to him, and judging by the enthusiasm with which his father returned his wave, he assumed the night's catch had been worth the effort. Adalward walked on. He tightened his orange and blue striped scarf around his neck in a vain attempt to keep the biting Arctic winds laced with snow and ice from tearing at his skin. He was glad he had put on his black insulated fleece-lined trousers and orange woolly pom-pom hat. It was all right for Magnus. He had his thick fur coat to protect him from Iceland's late winter come early spring unpredictable weather. Magnus was clearly on a mission this morning as he dragged Adalward along. Adalward turned one more time to look at the small town from where he came from before climbing up the coastal path. He could see the school lights were on and thought he would be sitting in there in an hour or so's time. Scanning the streets below, he could see that both Haldor and Fanna, his closest friends, were still in bed, evidenced by their bedroom curtains still drawn. They didn't have to walk their dogs at this unearthly hour of a bitterly cold, dark morning. And, coming to think about it, nor did his two older sisters. Adalward inwardly thought to himself, he must be mad, getting up every morning to take Magnus on this morning constitutional walk. Any normal 12-year-old boy would be tucked up in bed like his friends. It was unusual for Adalward to head off in the direction of Sungandisi Island. He normally made for the open moorland behind where he lived. In summer, when the tide allowed him, he would take Magnus to Landi Island to run free and do his morning ablutions. So, what directed him to Sungandisi on this cold Icelandic morning, he wasn't sure. But something was pulling him towards the island. Adalward turned right and walked up the steep path to Sungandisi Cliff. He knew the pathways, which was just as well, for it was still dark and sunrise was not due for another hour at this time of the year. As he clambered up, Adalward could hear all the goings-on down on the quayside as the ferry boat that took locals and tourists alike to the outlying islands getting ready for the day ahead. Adalward let Magnus off the lead. He normally did, giving his dog a bit of freedom to sniff around as dogs do. The seat near the small reddish-coloured lighthouse had a rucksack on it. Adalward looked inside it to see if there was a name tag on it. There wasn't. He'd take it into school to see if anybody recognised the bag because there was a school tie stuffed at the bottom. Adalward pulled out from his coat his iPhone 8, removed one of his blue Nordic patterned gloves to put his earpods in to listen to some music he had streamed. Occasionally, Adalward looked up to see where Magnus was. He could just make him out in the distance, sniffing and scratching around. Adalward, satisfied that Magnus was okay, focused on listening to his music. Wrapped up in his own little world, Adalward was unaware of how time was marching on, until he finally looked at the time on his phone and suddenly realised half an hour had passed. He jumped up immediately and shouted Magnus several times. Eventually, Magnus appeared with something in his mouth. "What you got there, Magnus?" Magnus dropped it. It was a bone. Adalward looked at the bone. He recognised the bone. Looking at Magnus, "Where did you get this from, boy? Show me. Come on, show me." Magnus didn't move. He just sat there as if expecting a treat. Adalward put Magnus's lead on. "Come on, Magnus, show me." Adalward took his earpods out and, along with his iPhone, shoved them back into his coat pocket. He picked up the bone with a tissue he had in his pocket, for he didn't want any of his DNA to be found on the bone, and he put it in one of Magnus's poo bags he carried at all times. Adalward waved the bag with the bone in front of Magnus. "Magnus, come on, show me where you found this bone." Adalward stumbled and tripped as he followed Magnus to the far side of the island. Magnus stopped briefly at the coastal path that led down to the rocks below. Adalward knew it would be stupid to venture any further, as there was still insufficient daylight. One wrong placed foot would send him falling to his death in the treacherous icy waters below. He'd come back later with Haldor and Fanna. It had stopped snowing and the wind had died down a bit, but that didn't stop Adalward once he had skillfully negotiated his way back down Sugansea Cliff and onto the quayside from sprinting all the way home. As he ran, his mind was crackling with all sorts of theories as to how the bone got to where it was. But he would do nothing or say nothing to anybody until he went back for a second look. It was Saturday morning, so no school. Haldor and Fanna had no clue as to why Adalward wanted them to go to Sugansea Island. The weather was unseasonably kind, gifting them a clear sunny day. Adalward walked with a sense of urgency, and for once he was dragging Magnus as opposed to the norm, which was Magnus pulling him. Haldor and Fanna were still trying to figure out what Adalward was so tight-lipped about. Adalward stopped at the very same point on the cliff edge on the far side of the island that he halted at yesterday. He opened the bag and got Magnus to sniff the bone. Haldor looked suspiciously at Adalward. "What are you doing?" "I don't know." Fanna cut in. "What do you mean you don't know? You've got a bone in your hand, and I suspect it's a human bone." "I've worked that out, Fanna. In fact, with what I can see from the internet, it's from a human arm. But whether it belongs to a man or a woman, that I'm uncertain of. But I have a niggling feeling that this bone Magnus discovered yesterday isn't on its own here." Adalward went on to tell his friends what had happened yesterday morning when he was here with Magnus. Adalward whispered in Magnus's ear, "Go." Magnus scampered down the cliff face. The boys followed carefully, picking their way down. At the bottom of the cliff lay scattered boulders that led to a tiny shingle beach, only visible when the tide was out. All three boys understood the local tides, and they knew they only had the best part of a few hours before the tide would sweep back in. So they would need to be back on the cliff top to avoid the sea's fury within good time. Above and between the boulders were a few small cavernous spaces. These and the surrounding cliff edges in Iceland's summer months would be home to puffins, kittiwakes and common eider, here for the breeding season. Only brave egg collectors would attempt to come down here between those months and face the relentless swooping attacks. But with it being April, and still so early in the season, Adalward, Haldor and Fanna didn't have to worry about that. Adalward noted which cave Magnus had crawled into. He clambered up, as did Haldor and Fanna. Haldor shone a torch, and all three boys stared at the collection of bones that were strewn around. The stench from the previous year's bird droppings was putrid. Adalward could feel himself starting to wrench and backed away. Haldor turned to Adalward and Fanna. "We need to gather these bones and take them to the local cop shop." "Absolutely not," screamed Adalward. "This is either a crime scene or some kind of ancient burial site, and judging by the conditions of the bones, I'd say this is a crime scene. Either way, we mustn't touch or interfere with these bones. We need experts to examine them." Vanna looked at Adalward straight in the face. So, how come you know so much about the conditions of bones? I've read quite a few books on criminology. The subject fascinates me. I want to be a pathologist when I grow up. What? Looking at and cutting up dead bodies? Adalward, you're weird. That's just your opinion, Haldor. The boys climbed back up the cliff face and walked back into the small town. As they did so, they chatted amongst themselves as to what to do next. Adalward knew they should contact the police, but Vanna had a different view. They only had Haldor's word that the bones were human. What if they were not? For there were no human skulls hidden amongst the bones. And how foolish they'd look if they got the authorities involved, only to discover they were the remains of some poor dead sheep or something. My mother has a friend who works at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik in the archaeological department, said Vanna. She'll know if that bone you have, Adalward, is human or not. I suggest we take it to her first, and as she confirms it to be human, she'll probably be able to date it. So we'll know if it's an ancient or recent bone. If it's recent, then we have discovered a crime scene, and we can then tell the police. If it's ancient, then the archaeologists can investigate. Either way, it'll put us in a good light with all concerned. Adalward and Haldor looked at each other and decided to go along with Vanna's suggestion for the time being. But as to putting them in a good light with the police if it turns out to be a recent bone, Adalward very much doubted that. So there you have an excerpt of the story. And I will take it on because it's going to be a very fascinating, intriguing story, because this is going to be a crime scene. And it's a crime scene of where I take you back to the Icelandic Cod Wars between Iceland and Britain. And it's about the bones. They are the bones of human bones. How do they get there into the cave? And the story will go on to involve the present Icelandic Prime Minister. What did his family know about what happened back in the Icelandic Cold Wars? How did those bones get there? Whose bones were they? I'll tell you that they were British bones of British fishermen who had disappeared, and the British authorities had come to Iceland to help to find them, but nobody found anything, no bones. But the Icelandic Prime Minister's father was under suspicion, and he was charged with their disappearance. But he got off because there was not sufficient evidence to charge him. But now the bones have come to light. Watch the story unfold, and what ramifications is it going to have for the Icelandic Prime Minister? So you see, kids, this is going to be a fascinating story. It's a crime thriller. It's a crime story. Because I said to you, Adalward was fascinated with criminology. And now I've told you, he wants to be a pathologist. And you can see how his friends, Haldor and Vanna, interact with him. They're supporting him. And how the dog comes into play. And you can also see that I tell you about, I said the black duffler coat. It was the blue and orange striped scarf, the orange woolly hat, the iPhone 8 and his fleece-lined trousers. I told you where the story is going to be set. And now you can see it all coming to light. But eventually, I will completely rewrite, I will do the story complete, and when I do my next book, you'll see the whole story unfold. Next week, I'm going to take you to, where shall I go? Norway. And I will introduce you to my Norwegian character in my Nordic kids stories. So until next week, take care, goodbye, and enjoy the stories.